There's a part of yourself you don't want to see. Carl Jung called it the shadow. It's where your fears live, your guilt, your worst impulses. But here's the twist. It's also where your hidden strengths are. The parts of yourself you've ignored, they're shaping you more than you realize. And the longer you avoid them, the more they control you. So, what's lurking in your shadow? We all have a version of ourselves we show to the world. Polished, put together, maybe even confident. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to fit in, to be accepted, to make life easier. But here's the problem. Not everything about you fits behind that mask. So what happens to the parts that don't make the cut? The frustration, the jealousy, the moments you wish you could erase. They don't disappear. They get buried, pushed into the dark. Jung called this shadow, the part of you you'd rather not see. And here's where things get tricky. The shadow isn't just made out of the bad stuff. It also hides the things you've neglected. Strength, creativity, boldness, anything that doesn't fit your idea of who you should be. But ignoring the shadow doesn't make it go away. Jung believed that when we repress these parts of ourselves, they don't stay quiet. They show up in ways we don't expect. Ever judge someone for being arrogant, lazy, selfish? Pause for a second. What if those traits actually reflect something buried in you? What if the thing that annoys you most in others is a part of yourself you refuse to see? This is what Jung called projection, the way our shadow leaks into the world around us. And Jung didn't just theorize this, he lived it. During one of the hardest times of his life, he fell into what he called a creative illness. It wasn't a sickness in the usual sense, it was an awakening. He wasn't just analyzing people, he was confronting the darkest parts of himself. And then he had the dream. Wait, dramatic effects. The dream. In this dream, Jung saw God, a symbol of perfection and light, drop a literal holy shit onto a cathedral. Wild, right? But it shook him, because to Jung, the message was clear. Even our highest ideals, the things we worship, have shadows. And if something as pure as the divine can cast darkness, what does that say about us? Every time we ignore parts of ourselves we don't like, they don't disappear, they fester. And if we don't deal with them, they find other ways to come out. Often in ways we don't recognize until it's too late. So, again, what is the shadow? It's the part of you you've locked away, but it's also the key to becoming who you really are. And in the next section, we'll explore what it means to live with your shadow, not as something to defeat, but as something to understand. Because whenever you like it or not, it's already shaping your life. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, consider subscribing. It helps me keep going. We like to think we're in control, that our actions, thoughts, and emotions are entirely our own. But here's the problem. What we refuse to acknowledge doesn't disappear. It finds its way back. Jung saw this as a challenge. It's not about being good or bad, but about taking responsibility for the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. And that's uncomfortable. So what happens if we don't? We push it away, thinking we've avoided it. But the shadow doesn't stay put. It finds its ways to surface. Maybe you lash out and wonder, where did that come from? Or you bury parts of yourself so deeply that you can't even remember what they felt like. It's not just habit. It's not random. It's your shadow moving without you realizing. So, what do you do? First, awareness. Jung compared this to a confession, but not to someone else, to yourself. Saying, I've been jealous, or I've ignored this part of me because it scares me, is raw and uncomfortable. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But recognition isn't enough. There's a trap waiting there. Projection. We talked about it earlier, how we see in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. And now let's take it a step further. How do you catch yourself from doing it? The next time you find yourself fixated on someone else's arrogance, weakness, or flaws, pause. Ask yourself, is this really about them? Or is it about me? Your mind will resist this. It doesn't want to go there. But the moment you pull that projection back, you take away its power. But working with your shadow isn't just about what's ugly. We bury anger, shame, guilt. But we also bury boldness, creativity, passion. Not because they're bad, but because they don't fit the role we think we're supposed to play. And once you uncover those parts, then what? Seeing your shadow isn't enough. You have to decide what to do with it. Jung called this integration. Not getting rid of your shadow, but learning how to live with it. And that's where the real challenge begins. Maybe it means reclaiming a part of yourself you wrote off years ago. Maybe it means facing a truth you spent a lifetime avoiding. And let's be honest, it won't be easy. But what's the alternative? Living a life dictated by the parts of yourself you refuse to face? Jung didn't believe in perfection. He believed in wholeness, light and dark, strengths and flaws. You can't choose one without the other. So ask yourself, what am I avoiding in myself? It won't be a comfortable answer, but it's the first step to becoming whole. And if ignoring your own shadow twists the way you see the world, what happens when entire societies do the same? When a whole culture refuses to look into the mirror and starts looking for someone else to blame? We like to think we've moved past the worst parts of history, that we've learned, that we're better now. But have we? Because if there's one thing the past proves, it's this. What we refuse to face doesn't disappear, it festers. And when entire societies ignore their shadow, it doesn't just stay in the dark, it finds a target. Jung warned about this. He saw how individuals project their shadow onto others, blaming them for the things they won't admit about themselves. But it doesn't stop at individuals. Societies do it too. And when they do, the consequences can be catastrophic. Jung wrote about Nazi Germany, a nation humiliated by economic collapse, desperate for someone to blame. And they found one. The Jewish people became the scapegoat, labeled as the root of corruption and weakness. Everything Germany wanted to purge, and that purge turned into one of the greatest atrocities in human history. But this wasn't the first time. Colonialism followed the same pattern. It wasn't about civilizing the world, it was about projecting Europe's shadow outward. Violence, greed, domination, while pretending to be righteous. And today, we think we're different, more enlightened. But are we? Look at social media, look at politics, look at how quickly people form tribes, find enemies, and dehumanize them. Ever notice how outrage spreads faster than reason? How entire groups are cast as irredeemable, evil, the other? And how people cling to their side, convinced they're the good ones, while the real problem is always someone else? That's shadow projection in real time. And here's the scary part. The moment you believe you're the good guy, that your cause is pure, that only others are corrupt, that's when the shadow has you. That's when history starts repeating itself. Because the worst things ever done weren't done by people who thought they were evil. They were done by people convinced they were righteous. So, how do we stop the cycle? Not by pretending the shadow isn't there, not by projecting it onto someone else, but by owning it. Jung believed real transformation starts with a single question. What if the thing I fear the most isn't out there, but inside me? Because the real danger isn't just the shadow we ignore, it's what happens when we mistake it for someone else. History proves it, but history isn't something that just happened. It's something we repeat unless we break the cycle. So, what now? We spent all this time talking about the shadow, how it shapes you, how it shapes the world, how dangerous it becomes when ignored. But knowing that isn't enough. Because now you have a choice. You can keep pretending it's not there, keep burying the parts of yourself you don't want to see. But here's the thing. The shadow doesn't just disappear. It works in the dark, pulling the strings while you look the other way. Or you can turn around and face it. Jung didn't see shadow work as shallow self-improvement. He saw it as the only way to stop being a stranger to yourself. And that brings us back to the beginning. We started this by asking, what's in your shadow? But maybe that's not the real question. Maybe the real question is, what happens if you never look? Because the shadow doesn't just wait, it grows.